Hi, everyone. You are tuning into our webcast brought to you by Corporate Citizenship and Bursa Malaysia. The topic we will cover today is on materiality. This has become a topic of increased interest among companies who are reporting on their sustainability efforts. And today, we aim to help the listeners understand how to apply the materiality principle in reporting in order to help you identify the sustainability issues that really matter to your organization. So before we delve into the main topic at hand, I thought I'd take a step back and try to help understand why this principle even exists. So every day in Malaysia, new issues are cropping up for companies. If you open a newspaper, you look at your competitors, talk to a nonprofit, or even engage a regulator, a long list of issues and ideas will emerge. Businesses are increasingly being asked to have a position on issues such as employee welfare, how they take part in tackling climate change, how they innovate their products to stay competitive in the market, for example. At the same time, businesses themselves invest in local communities. What positive impact do they have on the ground there? These are all very valid questions, and some of them are more pressing than others. So the reality is, no business can do everything. No organization can tackle every concern, and instead, one has to prioritize. So the concept of materiality, or the principle of materiality, is the process by which you decide which issues matter most to your business. Under Bursa Malaysia's requirements today, all listed companies must include in its annual report a statement of the management of its material, economic, environment, and social risks and opportunities. So you can see here in Practice Note 9, companies should mention a few things. Firstly, how these issues are identified, why they are important to the listed issuer or the company, and how these issues are being managed. And under these, the company should talk about the policies in managing these matters, measures taken or actions, and indicators that demonstrate progress in how these issues are performing, how the company is managing some of these issues. So in doing so, this inevitably unlocks internal business value. Here you can see it helps with strategy and risk management, resource allocation, external engagement, internal improvements, and communication and reporting. We will delve into this in more detail as we go along. So before we start, I thought perhaps I'd like to introduce the speakers for today. Before I start, maybe I'll introduce my colleague, Charlie. Charlie, would you like to say a few words?
Hi everybody, my name's Charlie Ashford. I'm a consultant for corporate citizenship based in London, working in the field of sustainability and corporate responsibility for about the last 6 years.
Thank you. And myself, I'm Junis. I'm the Director for Southeast Asia for Corporate Citizenship. We are a global management consultancy, and we specialize in sustainability and corporate responsibility issues. We were established over 20 years ago, back in 1997, and today we help companies with achieving some of their commitments with regards to being responsible business as well as in their sustainable practices. We have operations in London, where we're headquartered, as well as in Melbourne, New York, San Francisco, Santiago, and Singapore. All right, so basically, we'd like to cover a few things with regards to the topic at hand. Firstly, I will introduce what materiality means, more or less how you decide what is relevant, and as well as the materiality matrix, what that means. Then Charlie will take us through why it matters, as well as the materiality process, and then I'll finish off with designing an effective materiality assessment. Okay. So introducing materiality, let me frame this with regards to some of the issues in sustainability in Malaysia. So Charlie, if you can click on the next slide, thank you. So Malaysia is one of the fastest growing economies in Southeast Asia. And as the country continues to prosper and continues to develop in its economy with the rise of the middle income bracket, the strain on the local environment is an issue that can no longer be ignored. And while the government's trying to address some of these issues on a policy level, companies across the supply chain are realizing that the onus is also on them to be responsible corporate citizens. So here we have three examples of issues being reported by Malaysian companies. On the left-hand side is the company Senviro's sustainability report, where it manages, where it talks about some of the waste challenges that it faces in its core business. Of course, as a waste management company, this is an issue that is of increasing importance not just to business, but also importance to the Malaysia as a whole. On the top right-hand corner is telco Digi. Digi faces pressures obviously within its telco sector to ensure that it can continue to bridge the societal as well as the telecommunications gap across Malaysia. And the third example below, which is the one that is by Maybank, is an example of how it talks about its human capital being of core importance within its sustainability management. Now, as a bank, obviously, its people matter a lot. Whether it's the bank teller or whether it's the people out in the branches, Maybank obviously realizes that its employees play a very strong role in the way it runs its company, and so it focuses largely on the people that it services as well as who serve them as well. So in doing these, in talking about some of these sustainability issues, next slide, please. Thank you. This leads me to the topic at hand, which is materiality. So materiality is defined as the principle used in decision-making to define whether an aspect or an issue is sufficiently important to warrant attention by the business. And when we say sufficiently important, it refers not just to reporting, but also to actions, to strategy, to the way the business is being managed, as well as the way it conducts its performance. And so under Bursa Malaysia's guidelines on materiality, sustainability matters are considered material if they either, number one, reflect on an organization's significant economic, environment, and social impacts, or it substantively influences how the stakeholder can make its decisions. This is consistent to the Global Reporting Initiative standards, or the world's most widely used standards on sustainability reporting. And if you'd like more information on this, you can refer to Bursa Malaysia's website on its guidelines to materiality. So the question then is, how do you decide what is material to your business? Most companies do this by conducting a materiality assessment. A good, robust materiality assessment begins with three things. Firstly, having a clear understanding of your business objectives for the long-term growth of the company. Secondly, following a tight process that is focused on resulting in a good output to aid in decision-making. And thirdly, being open to different perspectives from your stakeholders. One example is the recent haze issue that has shrouded Malaysia and Singapore. While many fingers were pointed at the palm oil companies and their suppliers, the reality on the ground is in fact very different. Smallholder farmers often have the right to burn, and this may be the only method they know how to clear land and cultivate new crops. So simply by cutting off their supply chain doesn't mean that you're solving the issue. It can effectively deny them of their right to a livelihood. So three factors to determining the key material issues in a nutshell: purpose, process, and perspective. So a typical matrix in materiality represents, let me repeat that. So a typical matrix visually represents material issues based on their current or potential impact to the business that we consider as the x-axis, and the level of interest to stakeholders, which we consider as the y-axis. Developing a matrix requires objective judgment based on the insights that are gained. So in a way, it tends to be more of an art than a science, in a way that one needs to exercise some judgment and in doing so be able to form a more objective picture in terms of what is important to the business and its stakeholders. Also, not everyone who does materiality assessment chooses to produce a materiality matrix. Some companies or some organizations prefer to just list them as material issues. Whatever form the output takes, it is important to take note of the following. Firstly, it is that the matrix or the table or the list should represent the meaning that it captures. And secondly, it should present and describe a company's material issues, including its context and as well as the process that was used to determine them. So, for example, if we're talking about employee welfare, and that's considered a highly material issue within an organization, are we referring to employee health and safety, or are we referring to employee well-being? Both may be important, and it is important to understand the context of the issues and how it relates to the business. So at this point, I'd like to hand over to my colleague Charlie, who will take us through the value of materiality and why this is important to the business. Charlie.
Thank you, Eunice. Okay, so after that introduction to the basic concepts of materiality, we want to turn now to why does materiality matter to business? So firstly, as we've seen, expectations are growing of businesses in Malaysia and around the world. We covered earlier the specific Malaysian listing requirements. But beyond that, materiality and reporting on important sustainability issues is something that stakeholders around the globe are expecting from businesses. And materiality is the focus of a lot of sustainability standards, the GRI standards Eunice has already mentioned, also standards such as those from the Integrated Reporting Council, the IIRC, SASB, which is a US investor-focused standard-setting board, and other investor indices such as the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. But beyond those external drivers, what we want to convey in this webcast today is that materiality also offers businesses real business value. The number of sustainability issues that are competing for companies' attention is always growing, and it's really vital, more and more vital, for businesses to conduct materiality exercises to work out which sustainability issues really merit their focus and their attention. So the key point really is that effective management of issues requires prioritization. You can't do everything. You need to work out what is the most important for your business and for your stakeholders. And materiality is not just for reporting. As Eunice mentioned, it can be a key tool in the management of sustainability issues, and it can also help you to set your sustainability strategy. You need to start from a place of understanding what the most important issues are in order to set an effective strategy. So how does materiality create value for the business? In a number of ways. So materiality as a tool for strategic prioritization can help businesses to make sense of a big range of possible issues, narrow them down, and develop a prioritized set of issues for action. Materiality helps businesses to gather a 360-degree perspective on all of the environmental, social, and governance issues that they face and their stakeholders face. And by doing so, it can help them in a number of things. So first of all, the materiality process can help organizations to align their sustainability issues with their business strategy and to inform strategy development, as I mentioned, helping them to identify potential new opportunities for the business, helping them to identify emerging risks for the business, areas where investment is needed, help them to reduce costs, and so on. So really aiding the core business in the pursuit of its goals. Next, it can help to justify decision making and resource allocation. Obviously, if you understand where your key issues are, you know where to direct investment and really deliver appropriate policies and programs to tackle your key sustainability issues. Next, materiality can enhance engagement with external stakeholders, such as investors, customers, suppliers, regulators, and so on. And that could be both through your sustainability reporting and also informing other communications with those stakeholders. Materiality can also help you to build internal buy-in for sustainability policies and programs, convince your colleagues in other departments, your senior management, of the importance of these issues through showing that you have an understanding of what the business's stakeholders find important. And finally, as we've mentioned, one key part of materiality, but by no means the only part, is then influencing reporting and communication, allowing you to create focused reports with greater impact that really tell stakeholders about the issues that they want to hear about. So I'm going to move on now to describe a typical materiality process. Now, all materiality processes are going to be different because every company is different. So as we'll see, the precise steps and the precise details will be different from company to company and organisation to organisation. But what we're going to go through now are some general principles and some general steps which all organisations will want to consider when they're designing their materiality process. So an effective materiality process addresses three key questions that you can see here. First of all, where are we now and where are we going as an organisation? Next, what is important to our stakeholders and the long-term viability of our business? And finally, and consequently, where should we focus our efforts? So a few indicative steps for a materiality assessment in fact, are set out in Bursa Malaysia's Sustainability Reporting Guide. This basic process can be followed by pretty much any company, big or small, although, as I've said, the precise activities involved in each of these steps will vary depending on the company. So you can see here we start with identifying the objectives and scope of the assessment, establishing a clear process for where you want your materiality process to go. Next, identifying and categorizing sustainability issues, understanding the context and really mapping out all of the potential issues. Then using stakeholder engagement to understand that external perspective, also mapping and prioritizing those stakeholders, as we'll come on to. Then using that stakeholder engagement to gather a balance of internal and external perspectives on materiality issues to help you in step 4, which is prioritization, developing a prioritized list of material issues. And then finally, we have the review stage where you test your hypothesis, finalize your material issues, sign it off with the senior leadership of your business. So to go through these steps one by one, first of all, we're going to start with identifying the objectives and scope of your materiality assessment. And this is a really important first step. If you don't know what you want to get out of your materiality assessment, you won't get the full value from it. So you should consider your objectives. Are you conducting your materiality assessment because you want to help the board to set a new sustainability strategy? Are you more concerned with facilitating more effective engagement with your stakeholders? So those precise goals will obviously affect the way in which you carry out your assessment. Another important step is also to define the scope of your materiality assessment. Now, it might be that you want your materiality assessment to cover the entirety of your business. You may decide for particular reasons that you want to limit the scope by geographical boundaries, so the countries or regions that are covered, or organizational boundaries, so the particular parts of your business, business divisions, subsidiaries, and so on. You might decide, in fact, that you want to conduct a separate materiality assessment for different parts of your business if you're working in a very diversified set of areas. And finally, when we're considering the scope of the assessment, it's also important that we consider the what are often called the boundaries in terms of the impacts that you're considering. So you may want to consider not just the impacts that are caused directly by the organisation or contributed to by your organisation. You also want to look at external issues that have an impact on your organisation. So one example of that could be climate change. Obviously, as a business emitting carbon dioxide, you are having an impact on climate change, but you'll also want to think about the external risks and opportunities that face you as a business in a world where climate change is a reality, where we are seeing a shift to a low carbon economy. And for some businesses, especially businesses with quite a small direct carbon footprint, it'll be more interesting and more revealing to stakeholders to talk about how are you adapting your business to the risks and opportunities that are faced by climate change. And finally, and very importantly, you should also consider how you want to approach issues which may not be directly linked to your organisation, but are indirectly linked through your value chain. So issues that are facing your suppliers, issues facing your distribution chain, and through to your customers as well. So to take an example of all of this, there may be, say you're an organisation with operations in Malaysia as well as in Thailand, you might decide to start off with at least that you want to just make your sustainability disclosures about your Malaysian operations because the operations in Thailand are relatively new, you don't have the data monitoring mechanisms in place. And as you progress along your sustainability journey, you may then expand the scope of your materiality assessment and your reporting to cover all of your operations and cover issues that are relevant to potentially suppliers in Thailand as well. So moving to the next stage of the materiality process that I outlined is identification and categorization of relevant issues. So this is the stage where you really want to arrive at what we often call a long list of all of the potentially relevant materiality issues. So this is before you start the process of actually prioritizing these issues. It's just working out what is potentially relevant for your business. And you can use a variety of sources to develop this initial long list. These can include, as you can see here, internal sources such as board or board committee reports, risk management assessments, risk registers, minutes of management meetings, and so on. And then also you want to consider external sources. That could include regulations in the countries where you're operating, external standards, underlying criteria for investment indices such as the FTSE4Good Index, the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, NGO reports, stakeholder feedback, customer complaints, news reports. The list goes on and on. You want to understand the external context. And this list that's shown on this slide you can find in the Bursa Malaysia Sustainability Reporting Guide. You can also find in that reporting guide in Appendix A a very useful list of sustainability themes for your consideration in identifying and developing your list of sustainability issues. And that list has been put together using some of the sources shown on this slide. So it's some of the most common sustainability issues reported by businesses, featured in the media and so on. But it's important that you also consider what is important specifically to you as a business, to your particular industry. And that's where you'll want to do a bit of your own research, look at what your competitors are reporting on, look at the specific issues facing your industry. And after you've established your long list, you may also want to think about refining, categorizing the list. And obviously, when you're drawing together issues from such a wide range of sources, you'll probably find a wide range of terminology used to sometimes describe the same issue. So you'll need to decide what kind of terminology and definition and categorization makes sense for you as a business in order to arrive at this long list of issues for prioritization. So when you're finished, you should really have a coherent list of well-defined issues that make sense and are relevant to your business. So next in the process I outlined earlier, step 3 is stakeholder engagement. And stakeholder engagement is the process is all about first identifying and assessing who your relevant stakeholders are, and then understanding their needs and expectations and using that to inform your materiality process. So in terms of identifying and mapping out your stakeholders, these are a couple of examples on this slide from Net Printwork and Sunway, 2 Malaysian companies who report on their most important stakeholder groups in their reports. And you can see there are some stakeholder groups here who are probably relevant to most businesses or all businesses, such as employees, government, competitors, investors, and there are other specific groups on there. So you can see, for example, Net Printwork have pulled out artists and banks as particular stakeholder groups, reflecting the nature of their business. Sunway as well have a focus particularly on suppliers, media, NGOs. So there'll be a lot of common groups to a lot of companies, but you may have particular stakeholder groups that are more relevant or more important to your business. And you should consider as well, when you're mapping out your stakeholders, who are the most important stakeholder groups to you, because not all stakeholders are equal. They vary by their level of power and influence. They also vary by the level of interest that they take in your business, and also in their legitimacy in terms of how much you as a business value their opinion. So you should aim to identify your priority stakeholder groups in terms of those who are most important for your as audiences for your sustainability initiatives and communications, and also in terms of those who are most impacted by your operations. So when you're designing your stakeholder engagement process, considering that prioritization of stakeholders, it's important that you tailor the messages and methods of communication for different stakeholders in order to allow effective engagement. So you can see here 2 key concerns for that process. First of all, it's important to get the right balance, particularly between internal and external perspectives, to ensure that all of your key stakeholder views are captured and that issues critical to the business are appropriately reflected. You should also try to ensure that you engage with a representative number of stakeholders from each group to give a balanced view of the important issues. Now, how many stakeholders that actually involves will vary from business to business, and as we'll see as well, will vary by how you choose to engage with those stakeholders. So it could really range from a few interviews or round tables, focus groups with very key stakeholder representatives, say even a smaller number as 15 or 20, through to employee surveys of customers and suppliers that could be reaching hundreds or thousands of people. So you can see why it's important to prioritize and decide which groups to engage with and to get a good balance between those. The other area that you need to consider is the depth of engagement with each stakeholder group. As I said, there are a number of different ways to engage with stakeholders, ranging from broad surveys and forums to in-depth focus groups and interviews with individuals. So deciding who to engage and the best method of engagement will depend on your organisation's unique context, potentially the budget that you have available for your materiality process, the overall objectives of the process, and so on. So here's another example of a Malaysian company listing out their stakeholder groups in their sustainability reports. This is Maybank again. And the interesting thing here is that Maybank lists out not just its key stakeholder groups, but also the different ways in which it's engaging with those groups and the issues that it is identified as of particular interest to those particular groups. So you can see that the methods of engagement really vary from online engagement with customers, customer feedback channels via email, social media, meetings with regulators and suppliers, investor briefings, external reporting, interviews with the media. All of these things are examples of stakeholder engagement, and not just specific stakeholder engagement through the materiality process, but broader engagement that can also inform your materiality assessment. So, for example, looking at the records that you have of customer complaints and customer questions and using that as a proxy for the issues that customers are the most interested in. So the fourth step of our typical process now is prioritization. This is kind of the crux of materiality as a concept. As we covered earlier, you're thinking from a perspective of the issues that are related to your most significant economic, environmental and social impacts, and also the issues that substantively influence the assessments and decisions of stakeholders. Prioritizing your sustainability matters helps you to focus efforts, allocate resources, and you should undertake this prioritization process on the basis of your stakeholder engagement, on the basis of engagement with internal and external stakeholders, and the end result should be a list of your most material sustainability matters reflecting that prioritization process. And here on the slide we have a few quantums to consider, if you like, in performing that prioritization process. You want to consider, from the business's perspective, consider aspects such as the significance and the likelihood of potential impacts. You'll want to consider the boundary that you defined at the start of the process. You'll want to consider what are the actual impacts on the business of each of these issues in terms of costs and revenues, risks and opportunities, impacts on your reputation and license to operate. And from a stakeholder perspective, as I said, you can consider a combination of specific engagement with stakeholders as part of the materiality process, where you engage with stakeholders, ask them to prioritize issues and get their views in that way, but you can also take into consideration other stakeholder feedback collected across the business and use your prioritization, your identification of the key stakeholders in order to work out whose views you pay the most attention to in this prioritization. So now I've got a few examples of how companies represent their materiality issues in their reporting. As Junice mentioned at the start, a materiality matrix is one way of doing it and quite a popular way of doing it, but it's not the only way. And these examples that I'm about to share with you are designed not as a here's how you should do it, not designed to say these are the best ways, these are examples of the best ways of doing it, but just a few examples to show you the breadth of options that you have available to represent your materiality issues. So first of all, starting with a relatively simple one, you can see the way that Malaysia airports report on their material issues are not mapped out on the matrix, but listed out The only kind of categorization that's going on here is that Malaysia Airports list out their economic, environmental and social issues separately, but you can see that there's no indication of prioritization between the issues in these three lists. Malaysia Airports is basically saying all of these issues are material, they are important, but we don't consider it useful to indicate the relative level of importance between these issues. Next up, we have Digi, who reports a relatively simple materiality matrix. You can see, in fact, interestingly, they have, rather than plotting each issue on a particular point on the matrix, they have divided the matrix into 9 sections. And so within each of these boxes, they are then listing out the issues that matter. So in the top right-hand corner, you have the 3 most material issues for Digi, which are ethics and anti-corruption, service reliability and quality, and sustainable supply chain. But again, Digi are not indicating a particular prioritization between those 3 issues. They're saying those 3 are the top, most important for the business and for its stakeholders. This next example from Senviro, you can see is more of a classic example of a materiality matrix when issues are mapped out on both axes. You can see that one of the decisions that Senviro have taken is that because they have quite a large number of issues on this matrix, it gets potentially confusing. And so what they've done is used color coding, again, like Malaysia Airports, to categorize the issues into particular themes, such as community, environment, people, ethical business practices, and so on. The other interesting thing about this matrix is that you'll notice on the axis labels, rather than going from low to high, Senviro have labeled the axes high to highest. So this is again emphasizing the fact that that all of the issues on the matrix are considered highly material. It's just that some are even more material than others. And you can almost imagine this matrix as the top right-hand corner of a much bigger matrix, with lots more issues which are ranked a bit lower down, which didn't even make it onto this matrix. And finally, just to make the point that there's really a vast range of options out there, you shouldn't feel restricted to a matrix. Here is how Telecom Malaysia choose to represent their material issues. And in fact, they're using this radar diagram to represent just the level of stakeholder concern of each of these issues, from low to high. You can see again, they've used color coding around the edge to categorize those issues into different themes, and it's a completely different way of representing material issues, but again gives you a sense of what are the top issues that stakeholders really care about. Customer satisfaction and employee health and safety coming out as the top ones from Telecom Malaysia's perspective. So we've reached the end of our representative materiality process. Our final step here, step 5, is review and sign off of the materiality assessment. So this can involve a few different steps. First of all, the materiality prioritization you've arrived at should be submitted for internal management review, usually by your senior management or the board, who may want to make final adjustments to the assessment. So this ensures that the materiality assessment is a true reflection of the business priorities. It ensures buy-in across the organisation, so that everybody feels that they've had a say in the final version of the prioritisation. And you should also at this point establish a process for regularly reviewing your assessment and updating it, recognising that Things change, businesses change, the external context is always moving, stakeholder priorities are always shifting. And so we usually recommend at least a limited review every 1 to 2 years, and maybe a more substantive review if there have been big changes in the business or in its operating context. And it's also important to remember to feed back to stakeholders on the outcomes of the materiality process, show how the business is responding to their concerns, ask for their feedback at this stage, which can then feed into the next round of your materiality assessment. And finally, and most importantly, after you've arrived at your materiality prioritization, your final assessment, you can't just leave it at that and put it into a drawer or put it in your report and forget all about it. You need an action plan for how you are going to use that materiality assessment to deliver value for the business. What are you going to do differently as a result of your assessment? You should make sure that the assessment is reflected in your reporting and your communications, with higher priority issues given more prominence. And you should also reflect that materiality assessment in your strategy development, ensure that you're tackling the issues of greatest importance to the business and to your stakeholders. For example, by committing to new targets, new policies, new programs to tackle those sustainability issues. So at this point, I'm going to hand back to Junice. Having described that materiality process, Junice is now going to talk through a few of the common pitfalls and tips and tricks for designing an effective assessment.
Thank you, Charlie. Can you hear me well?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Great. Okay. All right. So I'll take you through the designing an effective materiality assessment. Earlier, Charlie covered the benefits, or rather the value of doing a materiality, as well as the process, and he showed a few examples of how companies do it. Some of them obviously very inspiring, and I'm sure many organizations would love to obviously emulate some of the good work that has been done as well by other companies. Now, we're going to address some of the tips in terms of how to avoid common pitfalls, as we call it, and also maybe to give an overview of the tools available to you as a listener. It's actually freely available. You just have to find the right link to get on to download the relevant information. So on the next slide, you'll see that we have listed the 5 common mistakes with materiality. So materiality may seem like quite a straightforward process, but many practitioners who start this process will very quickly realize that managing a tight materiality process is important to ensure that the results that you derive are not skewed, are actually accurately reflecting the situation that's on the ground with your business as well as with the stakeholders, and it also that there are implications on the overall approach and direction of your overall sustainability report. So 5 common mistakes or areas to watch for. Firstly, is that companies sometimes cover too narrow a scope with the issues. This may potentially result in having a very, very long list of possible issues, and some of them, can be grouped actually on a much higher level. So we'll talk about that later. Secondly, not defining the issue clearly. So having a clear definition for every potential material issue is, is seen as the holy grail to a good materiality. Thirdly, failing to prioritize. Well, the whole point of materiality is to prioritize, and the truth is a company cannot address everything. So also, the stakeholders actually don't want to know everything that you're doing. In the past, when many companies were reporting, it was a competition of how thick a report is or how many pages they can report on. It's no longer the case. Today's stakeholders really just want to know what really matters to your business and also to obviously them as stakeholders. So it's really important to know who you're talking to in your report. Fourthly, equal voices, rather treating all stakeholder voices equally. Well, that's actually a common pitfall. Many people think that it's a matter of just, taking the average of your stakeholders' voices, but actually it's important to have the stakeholders who represent the core business activities and key geographies being represented with the right level of weightage in a way. And the fifth common mistake is, avoiding difficult issues. It can be very tempting for many companies to, I would say, report on things that make them look good. That is not wrong, of course, because at the end of the day, you want your report to reflect on the good work that you're doing. But a great report is one that is balanced and authentic. And so the most difficult issues are sometimes often the ones that, the stakeholders actually do care about. So I'm just going to take you through them in a little bit more detail. So if you go to the next slide on covering too narrow scope of issues. So one common mistake is when it comes to defining these issues is when a company just focuses on, a very small scope within their core business. What is really important is really to consider all the issues that are important to the long-term commercial success of your business. So you need to consider, are you defining social, environmental, and economic considerations proudly enough? Have you captured all the topics that affects the role that the business plays in society? So here, if you look at, we're going to take an example of a consumer goods sector. Traditionally, they would report mainly on the environmental impacts or the community relations that they do in the areas in which they operate in. If you were to take a wider look at a company in terms of how it affects, how it impacts society and the environment, a lot more issues start to arise. New consumer needs, whether it's even a responsible marketing, especially as a consumer goods. Obviously, a lot of people buy into their brands and what they believe in a brand, so responsible marketing is important. Demographics, of course, are they targeting a certain group of people, the young, for example, who are vulnerable? Supply chain resilience, this is something that actually impacts greatly in many companies today, especially those in the global business. Then new regulations, especially if you are investing in new markets, you need to know what kind of regulations you need to adhere to. And product safety quality is obviously important because it will affect immediately how companies, or how your customers perceive your brand and whether or not you stand for good, reliable products. So these are, obviously issues that would very much affect a company in the consumer goods sector. And now, if you were to, the thing is, there are a lot of other issues as well on the horizon. If a company were to look at the wider scope and when they talk to the stakeholders, many other issues could arise as well. If they spoke to finance, for example, finance would tell them actually interest rates, are increasingly important. We need to really be careful in our headquarters because that would really strongly affect the way our credit structure is being run, or even HR would consider that succession planning to be important because that obviously is important for the rest of the business. Now, these issues are undoubtedly important. However, the truth is a company cannot manage all the issues. So ultimately, it has got to decide which are the issues that will matter most to the business as well as to your key stakeholders. Okay. In giving valuable advice, the first is to really start with a business context. At the end of the day, you are a business, and the purpose of doing business is to make sure that you will continue to thrive in the longer term. So in doing so, don't be afraid to look outside your functional responsibility. Talk to obviously to a wider group of stakeholders within your business, but also outside that might not even be related to sustainability, but would obviously be impacted by your business. The third point is to cast net wide at the research stage. So in a way to develop a longer list of possible issues that your company could potentially want to identify as material and work off that list to narrow it down to a shorter list. Right? So that's the first, I would say, common pitfall. The second one is not being clear with what the issue is. Now, this issue is really, this point is really about the issue itself that we're going to address. It's really about seeking clarity. So what are you actually going to put on the matrix? So let's say if you are a manufacturer of a food company, as we talked about earlier, and one of the key issues you have identified is an issue of obesity. the stakeholders who you interview tell you that, for them what's important is obesity, but actually it's about the calories you put into the food that is important. But then when you talk to other stakeholders, they might tell you it's different. They tell you that it's actually about making foods healthier, and that actually is, it involves you adopting voluntary standards. But then you might also want to think about what others might point to, which is a very big issue today in the food industry, and that's sugar. Sugar is one of those things where many academics, many businesses, even schools are trying to address in their own policies. And then consumers might even tell you it's actually labeling and food regulations, because this is driving the way consumers are buying. But then others may also tell you that it's actually other things, for example, advertising. This really, because advertising does affect subliminally or even directly the way consumers buy. And so regulation on advertising might be important in terms of, I guess, a company talking about its food. And then some people might even point it to portion sizes, because ultimately that actually affects the number of calories, which again affects obesity. So, at the end of the day, I think there are lots of ways you can, many ways you can skin a cat, as you say, many ways you can address a certain issue. The truth is, if you look at all these issues that your stakeholders have raised as a result of one big issue at the beginning, you start to need to think about which one of them is a key issue. So behavior change, it might be important, but at the end of the day, people read things in the news as well, and that could affect the way they perceive. What is really important, if you can point to the next slide, is essentially to keep it simple. It is important to recognize how strategic the issue is and how the company is responding to it. It's important, one thing, to address or recognize the issue, but it's another thing to point out as well the complex relationships that's related to these issues. Ultimately, it's really focused on what these issues, what the stakeholders really care about. So it's important really to focus on the issues and not the processes or the responses. One tip as well is to avoid debate language. So in a way, it's important to be quite specific with what you're trying to get at. And last point is cluster the issues where it makes sense. Now, sometimes another point is over clustering can also make the issue quite vague. So sometimes, as I mentioned earlier, it might be a pipe science kind of approach. But at the end of the day, you've got to really put a judgment call to it and really think of the target audience who's going to read your report and focus on that. Okay. Now, the third point is failing to prioritize. So here it's quite straightforward. Already the visual gives you a very good sense of the situation. If you were to put up all these issues as potentially material to your business, first of all, your consumers, or rather your readers, will get very lost in terms of what you're trying to say, which defeats the whole point of the reporting to start with. But also some of these issues point to a larger issue, as we talked about earlier. So the more you list, sometimes the more confused a reader can get. So what is really important is really to start to prioritize them as ruthlessly as you can, as they say. It's not possible to put all of them in a matrix, so let alone manage and report on them. So next slide, please. It's important to cluster the issues into interconnected themes, to prioritize ruthlessly, as we said, to ensure the highest issues are in the top right quadrant, as Charlie had introduced to you in the matrix. Consider the real business impact that these issues will have, or that the business is having on these issues, and also consider the likelihood of the issue actually having an impact to your organization. All right? And the fourth point in this is listening to all stakeholders equally. As we said, it can be very tempting to do so, and the danger is you might only listen to the stakeholder that shouts the loudest. In many industries, actually, this tends to be the case, especially if the stakeholder is a very active stakeholder in that group, for example, an NGO or the media, and that could influence the way the company wants to structure its material issues. Now, it's really important to take a step back and be rationalized and to rationalize that against all the other issues that your other stakeholders are talking about. So a solution to this in the next slide is to undertake stakeholder mapping. Now you might have just 10 stakeholders in the beginning, but you could amount to over 50,000 stakeholders, like one of our clients did. They basically interviewed almost all their employees to start with to understand what really matters to these stakeholders. And in doing so, prioritize based on the level of interest in the business, the level of dependence on the business. So it could be a supplier, it could be the people you hire in your business, the level of awareness and knowledge of the business, because sometimes when they're too far, I would say when they're too, when they're too far disconnected to your business, the knowledge of what's happening on the ground could be limited, and they could actually skew the way your results accurately tell a story. And fourthly, legitimacy and influence of the stakeholder. So it's important really to consider those stakeholders who actually don't have a voice. That's quite crucial, because that actually means that these stakeholders might not even have a say when they legitimately should have a say. You might want to consider these people as well. In the agricultural business, very often the smaller holders or the farmers themselves are sometimes neglected in this exercise. And actually, it's really a matter of going down to the field and really just listening to them and listen to what they have to say as a supplier in the upstream. All right. And here is an example of a really interesting matrix that we extracted from Bursa Malaysia's guidance. In fact, this categorizes stakeholders based on their influence and dependence. So in fact, when you do your mapping, you could actually use this tool and obviously concentrate on the ones who are on the top right-hand quadrant again, those who are collaborative, who obviously, would have a greater dependency on the business, but also have a strong influence on your organization. All right. And the fifth and last issue in this short list is avoiding difficult issues. So a great report is one that is balanced and authentic. People like to read what the company tells as honestly as possible. And sometimes the most difficult issues are the ones which, in fact, the stakeholders actually greatly care about. And so the temptation often is for companies to only focus on issues that are easy to talk about or already being well managed. And that is really a common pitfall that actually a lot of organizations tend to fall into. So what is really important, again, if you take the next slide, is to cast the net wide and listen hard to your stakeholders and what they have to say. Sometimes a survey being sent out to a stakeholder might only reflect a certain level of detail. Sometimes it's important to have a full, proper engagement with a certain stakeholder in which can give you more, I would say, the real reality of what's happening. Ensure there's a balance between the internal and external stakeholder views. This might be challenging in terms of a company investing in getting a right number of external people to give feedback, but to be honest, it's very much worth the effort when you look at the verbatims that come back in your materiality assessments. And then moving towards longer term thinking and solutions. So looking at the long-term viability of the business and really weighing that up against some of the feedback that comes back as well. So that's how we would say could sort of help you address the temptation of avoiding discussing the difficult issues. All right. So I've come to the end of the presentation. In this webcast, I might want to repeat again that we've followed the structure of the Bursa Malaysia's Sustainability Reporting Guide, which is aligned to the guidance of GRI. Bursa Malaysia has also detailed materiality and stakeholder engagement toolkits, which offer a lot of guidance as well as templates that you could use. So much more guidance is available in international standards if you are even interested to explore further, from general reporting guidance and standard disclosures in the GRI standards to investor reporting frameworks such as SASB, which is very often used in America, as well as the integrated IRC framework that's written IR there. So companies, you can decide which ones you want to use to combine your your efforts in helping you to develop your sustainability report and annual report. Okay, so we've come to the end of our webinar. Again, I'd like to say on behalf of Charlie and myself, thank you very much for tuning in. You've been I'm sure by the time you come to this part of the webinar, you've been a great audience. So thank you very much for that. And if you have any questions or feedback or even other, I would say, suggestions on other topics we could cover, please write to me. My email address is there, or you could call me on my number. I'm based in Singapore, but happy to take your email as it comes in. Thank you very much and have a good day.
Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.